December 31, 2006. Quietly, without ceremony, without headlines. The British Treasury transferred $83 million to the United States government. It was not foreign aid. It was not diplomacy. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was the final payment on a debt born 60 years earlier. A debt incurred not to win World War II, but to stay alive long enough to fight it. 3 generations of British taxpayers had paid the United States for survival. Not for victory. For oxygen. Britain finished paying for World War II 61 years after the war ended. And that single fact should already disturb you. Because wars are supposed to end when the fighting stops. Empires, however, end much later. What most history books teach is simple and comforting. America saved Britain. Lend-Lease was generosity. Allies stood shoulder to shoulder against fascism. But what they do not teach you is that debt is a weapon. And crisis is the moment it's deployed. The money Britain paid was only the visible layer. The interest checks were only the surface ripple. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States executed the largest peaceful transfer of wealth in human history. Not through conquest. Not through invasion. But through contracts, liquidation, and leverage. Britain entered World War II as the world's largest creditor nation. It controlled nearly 1/4 of the Earth's surface. Its investments spanned continents. Its currency anchored global trade. Britain exited the war bankrupt. Its gold gone. Its overseas investments liquidated. Its military bases leased away for nearly a century. Its economy shackled to $31 billion of American debt. Nearly $500 billion in today's money. But the real cost was not measured in dollars. The real cost was the empire itself. This was not charity. This was not partnership. This was asset stripping. Executed with legal precision. While Britain fought for survival against Nazi Germany. And once you see how it happened, you begin to recognize the pattern everywhere else. Because this story is not really about World War II. It's about how modern empires are built. Not with armies, but with balance sheets. Let me show you how Lend-Lease actually worked. What Britain was forced to sell. Who bought it? Why aid was cut off 7 days after Japan surrendered. And how a single loan in 1946 finished what the war had started. Because the same playbook used on Britain in 1941 is still being used. Right now. On December 8, 1940. Winston Churchill wrote the most important letter of his life. It was addressed to Franklin D. Roosevelt. The opening paragraphs described Britain's military reality. German U-boats were strangling Atlantic supply lines. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities night after night. The army needed aircraft, tanks, ammunition, fuel, everything. Then came the line that mattered. Britain was broke. Not strained. Not pressured. Not facing temporary difficulty. Broke. The British Treasury could no longer pay cash for American supplies. 7 months into the war. The money was already gone. In classrooms, this letter is framed as a plea between friends. A cry for help against Hitler. But read it closely. Churchill is not asking for help. He is signaling surrender on another battlefield. He is negotiating the terms of Britain's liquidation. Because before September 1939, Britain was not a declining power scrambling to survive. It was the financial center of the world. The British Empire spanned 35.5 million square kilometers. British citizens owned over $22 billion in overseas investments. Railroads in Argentina. Mines in Chile. Rubber in Malaya. Oil in Persia. London, not New York, set the rhythm of global finance. The pound sterling, not the dollar, was the world's reserve currency. Britain held more gold than any nation on earth. Except one. The United States. So how did all of that vanish in 7 months? Because when the war began, America did not join Britain. America stayed neutral. And neutrality came with rules. The Neutrality Acts passed by Congress were designed to keep the United States out of foreign wars. But buried inside them was a clause that would devastate Britain financially. Cash and carry. Belligerent nations could buy American weapons. But only if they paid cash up front. And transported the goods themselves. No loans. No credit. No favors. Gold on the barrelhead. Before anything left the dock. Britain had no alternative. American factories were the only source of steel, oil, aircraft, and munitions on the scale required. So Britain paid. And when the cash ran out, Britain paid in gold. In June 1940, under Operation Fish, the British government did something unprecedented. It loaded its entire national gold reserve onto warships and ocean liners. And sent it across a U-boat-infested Atlantic. $7 billion in gold bars and securities. The accumulated wealth of centuries. Evacuated like refugees. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. By November 1940, the gold was gone. But the orders for tanks and aircraft continued. And then the British Purchasing Commission in Washington sent a message back to London. There were no dollars left. Britain was 7 months into a war that would last 6 years. And already financially exhausted. This is where the myth of Lend-Lease begins. The story we're told is simple. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain but faced isolationist opposition. So he invented a clever workaround. America would lend equipment. Britain would return it after the war. Roosevelt compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. It was brilliant. It was comforting. And it was fiction. Because while Roosevelt spoke in metaphors, the real negotiations were happening behind closed doors. And the man running them was not sentimental. His name was Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury, Roosevelt's closest advisor, and the architect of Britain's financial dismantling. Morgenthau was not interested in hoses. He wanted assets. Before a single dollar of aid would flow, he demanded a complete audit of the British Empire. Every government asset. Every private investment. Anywhere in the world. Imagine the moment. Britain fighting for survival. London burning. And America's condition for help was financial exposure. Prove you are destitute. Liquidate everything first. Then we'll talk. British negotiators warned him. Forced sales during wartime would be fire sales. Long-term investments sold at pennies on the dollar. Britain's post-war future would be destroyed. Morgenthau did not care. If Britain still had assets, American taxpayers would not subsidize the war. Congress needed proof. And proof requires sacrifice. So Morgenthau chose his target. The sacrifice Morgenthau chose was not symbolic. It was surgical. Its name was American Viscose Corporation. At the time, American Viscose was the largest producer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States. It supplied textiles to civilian markets, military contracts, and global supply chains. And most importantly, it was British-owned. The parent company, Courtaulds, was a pillar of British industrial wealth. American Viscose was worth over $100 million. And it generated roughly $10 million a year in dividends flowing back to London. For Morgenthau, it was perfect. A visible, valuable British asset sitting on American soil. Easy to seize. Easy to sell. And impossible for Britain to protect. He delivered the ultimatum. Sell American Viscose. Deposit the proceeds directly into the U.S. Treasury. Use the money to pay existing weapons orders. Or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. The British delegation resisted. Selling a crown jewel under wartime duress would be financial suicide. The market would know Britain was desperate. Buyers would smell blood. But Morgenthau understood leverage. He knew Britain had no alternative suppliers. No bargaining power. No time. So on March 15, 1941, the British government invoked emergency war powers. And seized American viscose from its own owners. No negotiation. No auction. No fair valuation. The sale was arranged through American investment banks. Banks fully aware that Britain had to sell. The result was predictable. American viscose sold for $54.4 million. Roughly half its true value. Courtaulds was compensated in pounds back in London. Adding to Britain's internal debt burden. The dollars from the sale went straight to the U.S. Treasury. This was not an alliance transaction. This was a foreclosure. And it set the precedent. Because once the first asset was stripped, the rest followed. Morgenthau forced the liquidation of $650 million in American securities. Owned by British citizens. Stocks, bonds, shares accumulated over a century of global dominance. Families who had invested in American industry since the 1800s were ordered to sell. There were no exemptions. No delays. No mercy. By mid-1941, Britain had liquidated $1.1 billion in U.S. assets. Over $22 billion in today's money. Every transaction was tracked. Verified. Logged. And only after the liquidation was complete did Lend-Lease funds begin to flow. Aid did not arrive first. Extraction did. But the humiliation extended beyond balance sheets. In September 1940, before Lend-Lease even existed, Britain faced a naval crisis. German U-boats were slaughtering merchant shipping in the Atlantic. Britain needed destroyers immediately. The United States had dozens sitting in mothballs. Obsolete World War I relics. That the U.S. Navy no longer wanted. Roosevelt agreed to give Britain 50 destroyers. The price? 99-year leases on British military bases. Stretching across the Atlantic world. Newfoundland. Bermuda. The Bahamas. Jamaica. St. Lucia. Trinidad. Antigua. British Guiana. Strategic choke points. Deepwater harbors. Launch pads for hemispheric dominance. In exchange, Britain received rusting ships. That barely functioned. This was not an even trade. It was the geopolitical equivalent of pawning the family estate to buy groceries. Those bases became the skeleton key of American power, allowing the United States to dominate the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and eventually the globe. Britain had not lost them in battle. It had signed them away under duress. On March 11, 1941, the Lend-Lease Act finally passed Congress. The headlines called it the arsenal of democracy. Roosevelt framed it as moral leadership. America supplying freedom against tyranny. And yes, Lend-Lease kept Britain alive. Without it, Britain would have starved into submission. But the name itself tells the truth. This was not a gift. It was a lease. And embedded deep inside the agreement was a clause that would finish the empire. Article VII. On the surface, it sounded harmless. Britain agreed that after the war, it would eliminate discriminatory treatment in international trade. Free markets. Open commerce. Fair competition. But in imperial language, discriminatory treatment meant one thing. Imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic glue of the British Empire. A tariff system that made British goods cheaper. Inside empire markets. Canada. Australia. India. South Africa. They bought British products. Not because they were better, but because the system made them cheaper. American goods were often superior. American factories were more efficient. But imperial tariffs kept them out. Article VII required Britain to dismantle that system. To open empire markets. To direct American competition. British negotiators understood instantly what this meant. It was the empire's death warrant. Because once tariffs fell, British industry, exhausted, bombed, undercapitalized, would be annihilated by American mass production. But German bombers were overhead. U-boats were in the Atlantic. Britain signed. From that moment on, Britain was not fighting to preserve the empire. It was fighting to manage its collapse. As the war dragged on through 1942, 1943, and 1944, the transfer accelerated. American GDP grew 75% during the war. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and California ran day and night. And here is the critical asymmetry. Britain converted everything to war production. Exports vanished. Commercial markets were abandoned. America did not. American factories produced bombers and tanks. And refrigerators, radios, cars, tractors. While Britain fought for survival, America captured Britain's commercial future. Latin America. Asia. Africa. Markets once dominated by British firms were quietly absorbed by American corporations. By 1944, the transformation was complete. Gold reserves had migrated across the Atlantic. The financial center of gravity had shifted permanently. The pound was finished. The dollar was ascendant. But Britain believed sacrifice would be rewarded. They believed the reckoning would be generous. They believed wrong. August 15, 1945. In London, the war ended in noise. Crowds flooded the streets. Church bells rang. People danced outside Buckingham Palace. 6 years of terror were finally over. Britain had survived. What no one in those crowds understood was that the most dangerous decision of the war would be made 7 days later. Quietly. Without debate. Without consultation. On August 21, 1945. President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9620. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately. Completely. No transition period. No grace window. No warning. American supply ships already at sea were ordered to turn around and sail home. The lifeline was cut. From London's perspective, it was not just abrupt. It was catastrophic. The British economy had been rebuilt entirely for war. Factories produced weapons, not consumer goods. Agriculture was insufficient to feed the population. Britain imported nearly half its food. And most of its raw materials. All of it paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. When the dollars stopped, Britain faced something darker than recession. It faced starvation. Inside Whitehall, the shock was paralyzing. British officials had assumed, logically, that aid would continue through reconstruction. The war might be over. But the economic transition would take years. America disagreed. The war was finished. So was the patience. John Maynard Keynes understood the danger immediately. Keynes was not just an economist. He was the economist of the age. The man whose ideas would later reshape the modern world. And his diagnosis was blunt. Britain faced a financial Dunkirk. Without dollars, Britain would default on international payments. Lose access to imports. and ration food down to starvation levels. The country had weeks, not years. There was only one option left. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a plane to Washington. He was 62 years old. His heart was failing. The stress would kill him within months. But he went anyway. Not as an intellectual giant. Not as an equal. As a supplicant. Keynes believed Britain had a moral claim. Britain had stood alone for 2 years. While America remained neutral. Britain had sacrificed its empire. To preserve Western civilization. Therefore, America should provide a grant. $6 billion. Not a loan. A gift. Retroactive payment. For an existential sacrifice. Keynes called it justice. Washington called it unrealistic. The American negotiators were unmoved. The war was over. The American public was tired of Europe. Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labour government, which openly planned to nationalize industries. Justice, Keynes learned, was not a negotiable currency. The Americans offered a loan. $3.75 billion. 2% interest. Barely enough to survive. And it came with conditions. Designed not to rebuild Britain, but to finish dismantling its economic independence. The most lethal condition had a technical name. Sterling convertibility. Within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain would make the pound fully convertible. Anyone holding pounds could exchange them freely for US dollars. On paper, this sounded like free trade. In reality, it was a trap. During the war, Britain had imposed a closed system. Colonies and allies, India, Egypt, Australia, were paid in pounds. But they were forbidden from converting those pounds into dollars. They could only spend them on British goods. It was a lifeline. A way to keep British industry alive. Despite wartime exhaustion. The Americans wanted that system destroyed. They understood the consequences. American goods were better. Cheaper. Mass-produced. If convertibility was allowed, every holder of pounds would sell immediately to buy dollars. Keynes knew this. He fought the condition relentlessly. He warned it would trigger a run on the pound. That Britain could not survive. But Britain had no leverage left. The alternative was hunger. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed in July 1946. Keynes died in April. His heart giving out. Under the strain of trying to save his country from its closest ally. The winter of 1947 was the coldest in British history. Blizzards buried railways. Coal froze. Power stations shut down. Families huddled in unheated homes. Burning furniture to stay warm. And in the middle of that misery, the clock struck on America's condition. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound sterling convertible. What followed was not a market adjustment. It was a massacre. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds. Sterling accumulated for years. Was dumped for dollars. In 5 weeks, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars. By August 20, 1947, the hemorrhage was so severe that Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. A quarter of the loan gone. Nothing gained. The humiliation was total. The geopolitical consequences followed immediately. In February 1947, Britain sent a telegram to the U.S. State Department. For a century, Britain had stabilized Greece and Turkey. Buffer states against Soviet expansion. The message was short and devastating. We can no longer afford it. Britain was withdrawing. If the United States wanted to contain communism, it would have to take over. This message triggered the Truman Doctrine. It was the moment America formally replaced Britain as the global enforcer. Not through conquest. Through insolvency. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, British citizens became 30% poorer relative to the world. And yet, the debt remained. The 1946 loan was not forgiven. It was commercial. Interest accrued. Every year, for decades. The British Treasury wrote checks to Washington. Through booms and busts. Through empire's final collapse. Until December 29, 2006. The last payment. 6 decades after victory. But the story does not end with Britain. Because this was not an exception. It was a blueprint. To understand what happened to Britain is to understand how modern power actually works. Not through tanks rolling across borders, but through balance sheets, contracts, and dependency. Because Britain was not uniquely punished. Britain was simply the first. Let's return to the question history rarely asks. Who benefited? Not abstract nations. Not vague institutions. Specific people. Specific firms. Henry Morgenthau Jr. left office wealthy and respected. He was never investigated. Never questioned. The American banks that handled the forced liquidation. J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and their peers. Earned enormous fees selling British assets under duress. American corporations bought distressed properties at fire sale prices. American viscose, purchased for $54 million, was worth over $100 million almost immediately. Fortunes were made in silence. And above all, the United States government emerged as the ultimate beneficiary. By 1945, America held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. American military bases encircled the globe. Supply chains ran through American ports. Global trade cleared in American dollars. This was not victory by invasion. This was empire by finance. The British Empire was not conquered. It was acquired. Through a distressed asset sale. Managed by the U.S. Treasury. And then the pattern repeated. After World War II, Germany lay in ruins. The Marshall Plan rebuilt it. But not freely. Aid came with conditions. Germany opened its markets. Hosted American military bases. Aligned its foreign policy with Washington. Germany became prosperous. But dependent. Japan followed. Occupied. Restructured. Rebuilt with American capital. Today, Japan holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. American bases remain. Japanese sovereignty exists. Within boundaries. South Korea. Rebuilt after the Korean War. Protected by American troops. Integrated into American financial systems. Wealthy. Advanced. Strategically dependent. The sequence is consistent. Crisis creates dependency. Dependency demands concessions. Concessions transfer sovereignty. Britain in 1940 was not conquered by Germany. It was conquered by its ally. And this is where the story stops being historical. Because the mechanisms did not disappear. They evolved. The dollar's reserve status. The legacy of Britain's collapse. Allows the United States to finance deficits indefinitely. U.S. Treasury bonds function as the modern Lend-Lease. Allies recycle surpluses back into American debt. To maintain stability. Military bases ensure alignment. Trade rules ensure access. When crises hit. Financial crashes, pandemics, wars. The pattern reasserts itself. Liquidity flows outward. Assets flow inward. 2008 mirrored 1929. And 2025 is already rhyming. Emergency becomes justification. Stability becomes leverage. The mythology of World War II tells us. America saved Britain. The documents tell a different story. America bought Britain. Churchill understood the trade. In December 1940. He signed away the future. To survive the present. There was no alternative. But let's be honest about the cost. Britain defeated Hitler. And lost the empire. Britain won the war. And lost financial sovereignty. 3 generations paid. For the privilege of survival. This is not an anti-American story. It is a power story. Empires today are not built through banners and legions. They are built through debt agreements. Emergency loans. And the quiet rewriting of rules. When desperation eliminates choice. The special relationship between the US and UK is celebrated as an alliance of equals. But alliances are measured in leverage. And leverage flows one way. Read the contracts. Track the gold. Follow the debt. Lend-Lease was not the arsenal of democracy. It was the greatest asset-stripping operation in history. Executed while Britain fought for its life. And the playbook never changed. If this revealed how alliances really work. Subscribe. Because the same mechanisms used in 1941 are still shaping the world today. Just with cleaner language. And far bigger numbers. By the time Britain made its final payment in December 2006, the world no longer remembered why the debt existed. There were no ceremonies. No retrospectives. No reckoning. Just a quiet transfer. And the closing of a ledger that had been open since 1941. But debts like this are never just financial. They are historical artifacts. They tell you who had leverage. Who had options. And who didn't. Because Britain did not lose its empire in a single moment. It was not a dramatic collapse. There was no final battle. The empire was dismantled contract by contract. Clause by clause. Interest payment by interest payment. And once you understand that, you start seeing the same architecture everywhere. After Britain, the world entered a new era. A dollar-based era. The Bretton Woods system, designed in 1944, while Britain was already financially broken, locked the transformation in place. Currencies would orbit the dollar. The dollar would orbit gold. And the United States would sit at the center. Britain arrived at Bretton Woods. Not as an architect. But as a debtor. Keynes tried to resist. He warned that a system centered on a single national currency would give that nation disproportionate power. He was ignored. History proved him right. When the dollar later detached from gold in 1971, the structure didn't collapse. It expanded. Debt replaced metal. Confidence replaced convertibility. And American power became even more abstract. And more difficult to challenge. Britain never recovered its financial independence. Even today. The City of London operates inside a dollar-dominated system. Born from its own wartime surrender. And this is the deeper lesson. Modern empire does not announce itself. It does not arrive with flags or declarations. It arrives with emergency financing. With temporary measures that never end. With rules written in moments of fear. That shape decades of normality. When allies are strong. They negotiate. When allies are desperate. They sign. Britain in 1940 signed everything. And it had to. But necessity does not erase consequence. Look around the modern world. Countries hold vast reserves of U.S. Treasury bonds. Not because they are ideal investments, but because the system demands it. Military protection is intertwined with financial alignment. Trade access with policy obedience. The language is softer now. Stability. Partnership. Rules-based order. But the mechanics are unchanged. Crisis. Dependency. Extraction. The British case is simply the clearest. Because it happened at the moment one empire handed the system to another. The most uncomfortable truth is not that America acted ruthlessly. All empires do. The truth is that alliances do not override power. They merely disguise it. When Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in December 1940, he understood the bargain. He chose survival over sovereignty. Any leader would have. But what followed was not generosity. It was acquisition. Britain was not punished for losing. Britain was stripped for needing help. And that is why this story still matters. Because when the next crisis arrives, financial collapse, war, climate shock, the same questions will surface. Who has liquidity? Who has leverage? Who sets the conditions? And who will be told? There is no alternative. World War II is remembered as a moral war. Good versus evil. Democracy versus fascism. And that part is true. But beneath the morality was machinery. Financial machinery. And that machinery did not stop in 1945. It simply changed hands. Britain defeated Hitler. But the empire did not survive the victory. It was sold. Piece by piece. Under the pressure of existential threat. The final payment in 2006 closed the account. But it did not close the pattern. Lend-Lease was not an aberration. It was the prototype. And once you recognize it, you can no longer unsee it. Because the most powerful empires are not the ones that conquer territory. They are the ones that make conquest unnecessary. They let desperation do the work. They let debt finish the job. And they call it friendship.